Hi everybody, welcome to another makeover. And in today's video, I'm taking part in an ugly duckling challenge hosted by Cory and Dessert DIY. She's a very talented DIYer. She's actually one of the first YouTubers I had followed before I started my furniture flipping. The rules of this challenge are pretty simple. To pick up the ugliest piece of furniture we can find at the time and transform it into something beautiful. And for this particular challenge, we're gonna make it sparkle, which means using something shiny or glossy in our makeovers. And here's my ugly duckling. I found this stereo cabinet at one of the garage sales, and if I didn't buy it, it would go straight to the landfill. Honestly, it's not that ugly, but I'll try to make it look better. I had to clean the piece first. I sprayed some tea-speed greaser and I washed outside and inside of the cabinet. I was gonna keep the top wooden, so I had to get rid of an old top coat. As usual, I started with scraping, not a lot of luck there, but something made me think that this top coat might be shellac. I put some methyl hydrate, and if it's shellac, it's supposed to get sticky, but it didn't. But it helped to soften the top coat, so ta-da! I used the napkins to prevent methyl hydrate from evaporating too quickly, and I let it sit for about 5 minutes. And oh miracle, in 5 minutes I was able to scrape off the top coat completely. I mean, look at this. It's pretty awesome. I don't know what kind of top coat it is, but it's definitely reactive to the alcohol. Oh, and I forgot to say that I had huge plans for this piece. I was going to take a step away from my usual style of makeovers and try something different. I wanted to do a glam style in black and gold colors. After scraping, I sanded the top with 120 grit sandpaper. According to the amount of burning marks on the top, I can tell that this cabinet belonged to a smoker. Some of them disappeared after the first round of sanding, but some of them were way deeper. Especially this one. I knew I wouldn't be able to get rid of it, but I was hoping to make it less visible. And with 120, of course, I burned through the veneer a little bit. That burn mark made me think about changing the plans about this piece. I didn't want it, but I had to do something about it. I still was gonna paint the body of the dresser, and to make my life easier, I decided to take off the door. And I can tell you right now that it wasn't a fabric-made door. It was definitely someone's DIY project, but they never got to finish it. I also took off the back panel so I can have an easy access to the inside of the cabinet. Before applying any primer or paint, I scuff sanded the whole piece inside and out with 180 grit sandpaper. Partially I did it by hand, and partially I used my orbital sander. Before painting the piece, I decided to get back to the top and finish it first. I sanded it with 180 grit sandpaper, and the most of the leftovers of the burn marks, they came off. Except for the large one, there was no way I could get rid of it, but I had an idea how to hide it. I taped around this burn mark, and then I applied some Bondo I pre-mixed off camera. While Bondo was drying, I decided to build a shelf inside of the cabinet. My shelf is going to be pretty long, so I need something to support it in the middle. So I decided to go for the divider underneath the shelf. Right now it probably doesn't make any sense, but I promise it will as soon as you see what I'm going to do. I didn't have any wood or plywood big enough to build the shelf, but I did have some cedar boards on hand. All I need is to cut those boards in half, and there we go, the shelf is ready. And like I said, it all will make sense as soon as I start building it. But first I needed to patch the holes and some knots in my boards. For that I used the regular wood filler I had on hand. And there goes some missing footage. I probably didn't press the record button. There were some grooves on the inside of the door. I mixed some Bondo, I applied it, and here I'm sanding it. With Bondo is always tricky because sometimes there is a tiny air pockets in there, and after sanding they look like holes. But instead of reapplying Bondo, I used some sparkling I had on hand. The reason why I didn't want to use Bondo because it is stinky stuff. If you ever used it, you know what I mean. I work in a basement, and for mixing this I would have to go outside and do all this process again and then wait for Bondo to dry. This sparkling doesn't have any smell and it dries way faster. But that time my wood filler was completely dry. I scuff sanded this divider and I sanded both sides of the boards, started with 120 and finished with 220 grit. My sparkling was completely dry. I sanded it with 180 and it turned out pretty good. And if you're still watching this video, I want to say a huge thank you for that. We're almost there, I promise. Okay, I'm lying, we're halfway through. By that time, I kind of changed my mind about the design I was gonna go with this piece. And for that new design, I needed to expose some wood, but not on the whole door, just some area across the door in the middle, if that makes sense. My Bondo had dried and I sanded the whole top with 220. When I was done with sanding, I stained the edges of the top. For that, I used the water-based stain in the color Special Walnut. But I wasn't ready to paint yet. So I'm measuring the line where my divider will go. It's gonna divide the bottom part of the cabinet into two sections. And to secure that divider in place, I needed some dowels. I measured and drilled the holes in the divider, and then I did the same thing in the bottom, and I was hoping for the best. Because some holes in the bottom I missed a little bit. I squeezed some glue in the holes, I put the dowels in there. It looks good so far. We'll see what happens when I put the divider on. And here's the moment of truth. Da-da-da-dum. It works. To put my shelving board in to secure them in place, I needed to pre-drill some holes for the screws. There is kind of like a box inside of the cabinet. It was like that when I bought it, and I was going to screw the boards to the box. And for the other side of the boards, I needed a pocket holes to be able to screw them into the side of the cabinet. So here's the box on the right side, and here's my boards. And all I need to do is just put some screws in there. And for the other side with the pocket hole, I thought I got it filming, but I didn't. I moved my camera by accident and it felt my face mostly. And to make it even more secure, I decided to screw those boards to the divider. I patched the holes with a wood filler and I left it to dry. So here's how this whole thing looks from the different angle. And my divider is exactly the same size as the bottom part, but it's wider than the shelf. So I decided to make a cut on an angle. My husband said it was gonna be weird, but it's actually turned out really good. I sanded the cut smooth and I also sanded the wood filler on the shelves and I was ready to paint. I looked at the dresser and I didn't see it in black. It just didn't work in my imagination. I decided to go for the light beige color. Yeah, I know it's totally different thing. The funny thing, I didn't have a beige color on hand. I had the custom mixed light green color and I had fusion mineral paint in a dusty pink color, and the combination of those two colors gives me the exact color I wanted. And I know you expected me to paint, but first my crazy idea goes. I found those birds on Pinterest and I decided to transfer them onto my dresser in two different ways. I printed them out and I made DIY paper stencil. Then I taped the areas I was gonna transfer my birds, and then I just transferred the birds on the tape. I did 3 birds on the top, and I was going to do 3 birds on the door. And then I just made a cut. I cut the birds out of the tape for the top. So the idea was to paint them the same color I was gonna paint the dresser. And I transferred the same birds, but in a different order onto the door. But this time I left the birds taped. And I finally was ready to paint. First, I'm priming the whole piece. I'm using Kiehl's Stain and Odor Blocking water-based primer. And oh my gosh, what a pain in the bottom was to paint those burlap parts. I primed inside of the cabinet as well, but the shelf I decided to keep it wooden. I told you before that I have a spray gun, but I barely use it because I work in a basement. And usually it's way faster for me to use a roller and a paintbrush. But in this case, I wouldn't mind to use my spray gun because of that burlap area. And so it happened that my husband was roofing at the same time and he was using our compressor. So I didn't have a choice. And the worst thing, I had to apply 3 coats of paint. And here it goes, the most exciting moment. My paint was completely dry and I was ready to remove the tape. And they turned out so great, except for the primer around the edges. It was like a white canvas around the bird. The tape worked perfect, the edges were sharp, but I think it's just my paint job. I didn't apply enough paint at the edges. I was about to take a small brush and paint the edges, but first I decided to take off the tape on the door. And guess what? Same thing. The white primer around the birds. And you know what? Instead of going around the edges with the paint, I decided to leave it as it because they match and it kind of gives that vintage look. I sanded the birds with 320 grit sandpaper and around them some paint. I sanded some paint too. And because there was no way I would repaint the door, I had to take the little brush anyways. And I just painted the areas I sanded through the paint. To match the top, I stained the shelf with the same water-based stain I used for the edges. And I love how it turned out. It's a bit darker than the top, but it gives the piece that finished look. To protect the piece, I applied 2 coats of polyurethane to the whole piece, inside and outside. Did I mention that it was a pain in the bottom to work with those burlap areas? But anyways, I was almost there, almost done. And I looked at the piece while the top coat was drying, and I couldn't get rid of that feeling that it looked kind of like bland. It was the end of the day and I just left it like this. But I kept thinking, and there we go. 10 o'clock in the evening, I'm wearing my pajamas and I get back to the piece and I decided to glaze it. For glazing, I use a gel stain. It's very thin gel stain in the color chestnut. The funny thing, I'm not a big fan of glazing. I don't do it often. It was probably a second time, and I actually restored 2 pieces with the glazing. I completely stripped the paint with the glazing off. But here, that piece, it just asked me. And you know what? The glazing did its job. The piece looked way better. Next morning, I came back to the piece and I was absolutely happy. I applied the additional coat of poly to the top, and it was time to make this piece sparkle. I'm not gonna lie, I failed this part, like 100%. I used my gilding wax only on the hinges and on the knob. I told you that my original plan was to use way more gold, but sometimes it's just the way it goes. Maybe, possibly, I could have done the birds golden, but back then this idea didn't come into my head. The last step to add the hardware and put the door in place. And we're done here. Let me remind you how this piece looked before, and here's the after. Maybe I didn't make this piece sparkle, but I definitely made it shine. To me, it looks way better than it looked before. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like that type of content, would you mind to hit that subscribe button? That's free for you and means the world to me. And don't forget to go and check out that playlist to see more ugly duckling transformations.